Hey, everybody. Okay, so today we're going to talk about ecological interactions and biodiversity. And we are in the part of the course outline under community ecology. And today, what I'm looking for you to get out of this discussion is being able to, you should be able to identify the most frequent common types of ecological interactions and the structure of those interactions in these coastal communities, what biodiversity is and how we measure it, or the types of measures that we would take, and what are the benefits and limitations of on biodiversity. So, when we talk about species interactions, there are five basic types. These are things you probably studied in basic biology, botany, zoology, environmental science. And this would include competition, predation, parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. So, probably the easiest one and most common, or one of the most common types, is competition. And so here you've got individuals within a species or different species that are trying to utilize a shared resource, but that resource is limited in terms of its supply, and therefore they're competing for their relative access to that particular resource. So this generally results in a reduction of survivorship, growth, or reproduction, and this typically occurs across both parties, although that might not be equal between those two. Now, again, in those same courses, you probably looked a little bit at density dependent versus density independent interactions. And so competition is always density dependent. The more organisms, more species you have trying to share a resource, the more significant that competitive relationship is going to be. So there are two basic types of competition: exploitative and interference type. Exploitative competition is really where one organism's use of that resource reduces the availability of that resource to other organisms. And again, this can be organisms within a species or organisms between different species, right? Whereas an interference type relationship actually uh, it causes direct harm to other organisms while they're seeking that resource. So an example might be for exploitative. You've got two different birds that are feeding on the same fish. So the more of one species of bird that gets that fish, the less there are for the other species of birds, right? Whereas with interference, one species of bird might actually attack other birds that are feeding on those fish, injure them, or drive them away, right? So there's direct harm there. So when we're talking about plants, then what type of competition do plants exhibit? Well, truthfully, it can be either, right? So if you have a mixed community, a biodiverse community, those communities are using resources that can be water, that can be um, nutrients, and could be access to pollinators, for instance, right? And so there can be competition that's exploitative, right? So if you've got only a certain amount of, a limiting nutrient, for instance, then the plant that's better able to access that limiting nutrient is probably going to get more of it, which is going to leave the other species in a little bit of a lurch, so to speak, right? Whereas with um, plants like we're going to look at dodder vine, but there's a lot of them, kudzu, for instance, where they actually grow over and will completely blanket other species. That could be a really good example of an interference type of competition where that plant is literally interfering with and harming another species, right? So when kudzu, for instance, actually covers over, and we do have kudzu vine, Japanese type of vine, Asian vine that occurs here in Southeast Texas. When it overgrows a tree, for instance, it completely covers that tree. I've seen things that look like topiaries that have the actual thing underneath it. Um, so in any event, that could be an example of an interference type of competition. Okay, so as I mentioned, competition can be interspecific or intraspecific. So inter is among species, whereas intra is within a species, right? So you can have individuals out competing other individuals within a single species. More commonly, I think you hear about it between different species, but you should know that it does occur within species as well. Okay, so let's talk about this example of competition across salt marsh zones. So you can remember that flooding, anoxia, salt exposure, these are controls that really limit the number of species that are going to be able to tolerate those stressors. And so it's harsh conditions, and there just aren't a lot of plants that are adapted to those environments. Whereas when you go upslope, you lose those stressors, and the consequence of that is that you have more competition because there are more species that can inhabit those areas. Some of them have other competitive advantages that allow them to exploit areas of those upslope habitats that some of the stress tolerant species there's not an advantage to them moving upslope because of that competition where they have an advantage in the lower areas of that slope. So there's this inverse relationship between competitive ability and stress tolerance. So an example of this would be Spartina alterniflora as compared to Spartina patens, right? So Spartina alterniflora, it's going to be in that intertidal zone, right? And you can see down here in this graphic. And that's because it can tolerate those anoxic conditions. It has that parenchyma in its roots. Now, it's also salt tolerant, right? It's able to manage that salt. But Peyton's doesn't have that ability. So the consequence of that is that it doesn't, it's going to find itself more in these upslope areas where it's not subject to that stress. And that reduces the amount of competition that it has from the Spartina. And the Spartina is typically not going to move its way upslope because that's going to expose that Spartina to more competition from more different species. And the further upslope it goes, it might even get into ibifrutescence, right? So, and as an example of that, so I recently closed out a project, a grant-funded project where we were studying restored habitat in Texas City, and the restoration process used these berms, right? So we've talked about berms before, but so they're called terraces, and so these terraces were on a 1 to 3 slope, and they were sprigged with Spartina around the edges in the intertidal zone, and so very typical approach. Initially, during that first year, remember, Spartina is all about providing, it's all about growing in that first year or so above ground biomass, right? And so we saw Spartina actually poking through in the very center of the berms that were 1 to 2 feet above the intertidal zone in an area that typically would not favor Spartina. But in that instance, because those berms were new and they were only sprigged with Spartina around the intertidal zone, the caps, the middle part of the berms, were bare. And so the Spartina would send rhizomes up, and you see these Spartina sticking up through the berm. Um, until we got into the next couple of years, and then you start to see more plants, volunteers essentially colonizing from adjacent areas that are better adapted to those higher zones. And that had the tendency to kind of push the Spartina alterniflora out. Again, not really an advantage for the Spartina since it's well adapted to those anoxic conditions to move up those slopes. And again, sometimes they're at a competitive disadvantage for other things like maybe higher salinities or other types of conditions. Okay. All right, so this is just more of the same there. Okay, so predation is another type of action. And so you learned about trophic levels, I'm sure, in your basic biology classes. Predation is where you have one live organism consuming another live organism, and this always results in the death of the prey. It's usually very quick, right? And usually death has to occur before biomass consumption occurs. So does this occur in plants? Yes. In fact, we have some really good examples in Texas. And if you have the opportunity to get up to the Big Thicket, there is a national forest there, and they have a great stand of pitcher plants, which are insectivorous plants, right? Um, so one of the questions I see occasionally is, does the prey always have to be an animal? And you could consider the consumption of whole phytoplankton by things like whales as a type of predation because the whole organism is consumed and it dies as a result. And you would differentiate this from herbivory, where in this case, the plant might be consumed in part, but there's not really an immediate mortality of the prey, right, of the plant. So lethality is very, very rare in those instances, and the effects can be extremely variable to virtually unnoticeable in some instances to more obvious where you see those kind of things. So here some examples where you might see portions of a plant that are consumed by various species of insects, right? So this would not count as predation. So another type of interaction is detritivory, and these are organisms that consume dead organic material, detritus. This is very common in wetland environments because with these plants, as they go through their life cycles, in Spartina, for instance, when it goes into senescence in the fall, as that plant dies back, then that material falls to the ground, and you have a variety of different organisms from all different types of invertebrates, for instance, that consume this material. So I would consider this one of the very important actions in these coastal plant environments. Um, Actually, before I move forward, you can see, so one type of organism here is crawfish and certain types of crabs. Actually, all crabs are detritivores, but in these coastal marsh environments, we have a number of different species that are very important detritivores. So they're constantly breaking down that material. Um, in the upper part of the bay, where we have a high level of organic and some inorganic pollutants that can also find their way into that detrital layer on the surface of the sediment. That material can be uptaken. The crabs can uptake that into their systems, and that can actually be problematic for people who eat some of those larger crabs. Think blue crabs, for instance. But again, these organisms are very important in this particular role. Okay, so how do these trophic interactions structure these communities? Well, there are two different controls here. There's top down and bottom up, right? So in top down trophic interactions, the herbivores are really limited by predators, top level predators. So, typically in most food webs, you've got 3 or 4 trophic levels, and that's limited by energy, as we'll talk about here in a little bit. But so you'll have a handful of predators, top level carnivores typically, that are consuming either other carnivores in some instance, lesser carnivores, or predominantly herbivores. And then the herbivores are, of course, feeding on the plants. Well, the herbivore population is very much limited by their predators. And so that herbivore control allows for the plants then to proliferate. Now, it's not unusual to see this kind of binary relationship between predator and prey, whereas the amount of the prey goes up, the number of the predators actually follows pretty quickly, right? So you see these kind of increasing relationships, but as the predator becomes more numerous, it puts more pressure on the prey, and the prey starts to decline, right? So in these relationships between top predators and herbivores, that can also have an impact on, across years, where you might have healthier stands of plants, and more plants, more biodiversity, more biomass, and then others where that's less. And it kind of hinges on this relationship between the predators and the herbivores. With bottom up, you have bottom up controls where plants grow, they're adapted to grow fast to recover from the pressure that's put on them by herbivores or other aspects of the environment. And so this creates plenty of food for herbivores and for the top level predators, but the plants themselves are limited by the amount of energy they're going to get from the sun, which drives photosynthesis, but also from nutrients that are in the soils that they're pulling those nutrients from. So that becomes a limiting factor, a bottom up limiting factor for those plants. So you have both of these things occurring in most trophic relationships. Now, again, as I said, energy is key to this energy flow. So, and the amount of biomass that's there. So, really, the amount of inflowing energy, solar energy, is a big driver in terms of how much biomass any ecosystem can, in fact, support at any of those trophic levels, right? And that is a bottom-up type of control. And it's generally predicated by the amount of energy versus the amount of space, so insolation, right? The amount of sun that strikes an area varies across the surface of the earth and seasonally. And so that is a particular driver. And what we find is that a lot of these, the habitats that have the highest amount of biomass production occur in estuaries and swamps and marshes and in tropical rainforest. And part of that has to do, a large part of that has to do not only with the ambient conditions on the ground, but the amount of solar energy that they are receiving. So there you go. These are at the root of these interactions. Sorry, I couldn't pass it up. So another relationship here is parasitism and disease. So the parasitism, there we go, is where you have two species that are living in an obligatory relationship with one another, where the parasite really depends metabolically on the host. So we have hemiparasites and haloparasites. Hemiparasites can, in fact, are plants that can, in fact, photosynthesize on their own. So they might use another plant as an anchor or for some nutrient, those kind of things, but they are able to photosynthesize. Whereas a haloparasite is a parasitic plant that completely depends on the metabolic relationship with the host. So one example of this is commonly referred to as dodder vine. And you'll see this quite a bit. It's an introduced species. It's another Asian species. A lot of Asian species and a lot of South American species thrive in our area of the Gulf Coast, and actually much of the Gulf Coast, because we have hot, humid conditions. And so organisms from other parts of the world that are well adapted to those conditions typically do very well in our environments. Plus, they oftentimes don't have controls, top-down controls, so they don't have predators that are consuming them in a way that controls their population. So they have a competitive advantage a lot of times against our native species. In this instance, though, dodder vine is parasitic, and it is considered a halo parasite. So it doesn't photosynthesize on its own. It depends on its relationship with the host, and it can kill those underlying species. Disease is differentiated from parasitism in that typically we're talking about pathogenic organisms in a host in which the host actually suffers physiologically. So where you have a disease, eventually, under most circumstances, that host is going to die back or die altogether as a result of that. So trying to come up with a good example of a disease vector, but one way to differentiate parasites from disease organisms is size. So generally, when we're talking about diseases, we're talking about microscopic organisms, so fungi, bacteria, those types of things. You can also have mutualism. So mutualism occurs Mutualism occurs where you have an association between a pair of species that brings some sort of mutual benefit. This can range from facultative to obligate types of relationships. With facultative relationships, generally the partners both benefit from the relationship, but neither is strictly dependent on the other. So those species can actually do just fine on their own, but they benefit, they facilitate the activities of the other species, right? So there's an advantage to being together, but they can't survive on their own. As compared to an obligate, where you have this tight coupling that exists, where one or both of the species needs the other in order to be able to survive. In other words, it can't survive on its own. Um, so you see lichens are a good example of this. So lichens are really great farmers. So they oftentimes will host cyanobacteria. And the fungi benefit from the carbohydrates that, when I say they're great farmers, is they benefit from the carbohydrates that are that actually are produced by the cyanobacteria, right? And there's that benefit there. The cyanobacteria, likewise, they benefit from the moisture that and essentially the environment that is produced by the fungi. So there's this relationship where both species can benefit from one another. Now, in some instances, there are some types of lichens, like bracket lichens that grow on trees, that engage in this relationship, but they also are parasitic on some of the trees. So again, you can have multiple relationships occurring with different species. So mycorrhiza is a good example of mutualism, where you have fungus and plant root tissue existing together. And so this is a type of mutualism where the plants typically benefit significantly in terms of the amount of biomass that they're able to produce because of the activity of the fungus. Um, and so for the most part, this is what we refer to as facultative, because they can exist separate from one another, but they do tend to benefit from the presence of one another. All right, so another example are fiddler crabs and Spartina alterniflora, right? So there have been some studies done. I've linked one or two here. Um, but essentially, when you look at these two species, they're in a mutualistic relationship. It is facultative. The benefit here is that the crabs help alter the soils and the environment in a way that benefits the plants, and the plants provide nutrients and detrital matter for the crabs. So let's unpack this a bit. So these studies generally looked at setting up plots where you had crabs that were with the Spartina and other plots where they were excluded. And generally, where the crabs were, there was a significant difference in terms of the number of inflorescences, flowers, right, stem density, and higher biomass production. Um, they benefit the plants. So the crabs, they do some things. They lower the amount of anoxia that occurs in those soils. And you can think about because of the digging that they're doing, but they also increase detrital decomposition. So these salt marsh plants essentially they benefit the crabs because they're providing structure, right? That helps support the burrows, helps prevent them from collapsing. Another thing that they do is they provide the material, a lot of the detrital material that the crabs can then break down, which then re-releases those nutrients into the soils, which benefits the plants, right? So you've got these crabs burrowing that allows oxygen into the soils. They're mixing all that up. But then you also have this benefit from the plants to the crabs. So again, this is a facultative mutualism facilitation. So they're facilitating one another, but they don't really rely on each other in order to be able to survive. Okay, so another relationship, and the last one I want to talk about here is commensalism. This is an association between a pair of species where one species benefits and the other is not significantly affected. So this might be epiphytes or epifauna. that might grow on another species, and that species is not really benefiting from it, but the epiphyte or the epifauna might be using that base as an anchor, or as a place from which they might source food, right? But the plant itself is not really either helped or harmed by that. It's kind of indifferent to that relationship. Okay, so let's talk about species diversity. Species diversity is an index. So I'm going to be using the Simpson's diversity index, but there are others out there. There's a number of these. So Simpson's, here you're looking at the number of species or the species richness and its relative abundance in this community. And the idea here is that you're going to get a number at the end of this that is the higher that number is, typically the more diverse that is, right? So the more diverse that community would be considered. Um, and that's rooted in some elements of the difference between the richness of a community and the relative abundance. There are other indexes. So there's like the Jacquard's evenness index is another one, because how many individuals in each population within in a community in part defines the relative importance of their functions, right? So, I also calculate importance values or another metric we use a lot of times in these communities. So there's a lot of kind of different ways to come at that. This is one index that is particularly valuable that I want to share with you. I understand that there are others, and you'll probably cover some of these in your labs over the course of your program. So, as an example, right, here we've got a community that has a species richness of 2 species, and the number of individuals in those 2 species is relatively similar. So you would calculate this where you're going to take the number of species one, divide it by, you're going to set up this proportion, right? So you're dividing it by the whole, square it, you're going to do the same thing with the second species. You get ultimately a value of 0.52. Now, in order to get this value, you're going to subtract that number from 1, all right, which is going to leave you with a 0.48. Okay, so let's compare this to another species. So your clicker question in class was this one. In the second community, here we've got the same species richness, but there's a significant difference in the number of individuals in each of those species. So what do you end up with here? Well, um, here you end up with a much lower diversity index because of the overwhelming number of species A relative to species B. This could have impacts on species B in terms of what functional role it plays, and whether or not it's going to be persistent among other functions within that biologic community. So this index value is going to be lesser. So we would consider this to be less diverse than the first one. All right, so let's look at productivity. Productivity is really a very valuable measure when we are measuring and comparing different biologic communities, equally so to measuring diversity, right? A lot of my work looking at these coastal marshes, one of the ways we oftentimes determine success is by the amount of biomass that is produced, or by the productivity of plants by measuring the amount of chlorophyll that's in them is another good measure of their productivity. So one of the questions that arises when we're doing these comparisons of productivity is, do diverse communities function differently than less diverse ones, or even more so monocultures, right? So what kind of things might make a diverse community more productive? Well, if species are redundant in their function, then the same biomass of a monoculture versus a mixed assemblage should yield the same result. But sometimes there are interactions among species that can make a mixed species community more productive for the same amount of biomass as a monoculture. And so there have been a couple of studies that have done this. One of the probably most cited ones is one that looked at grasslands. And again, there have been a number of these, but generally what you see in these grasslands is that you might have two species. Then in a monoculture, the yield, and so by yield we mean that dry biomass, right? The dry matter. You get more production, from one species than another, but when you blend them, essentially you just get an average of those two things. And so you see this with mixture one, right? This is just a bare average of those two. There's no real interaction occurring between those two species that is going to allow for a benefit to them that's going to create an over productivity that's above either one in a monocultural environment. However, if you look at the mixtures 2 through 4, here you're seeing some type of positive interaction where the combination actually yields a good result, and in some instances may yield a better result even than monoculture one, right? So again, this is called over yielding, and this is where you have that high level of productivity. So one study that really looked at this is I mentioned is these grassland studies, and a lot of prairie work that's been done over the years. So this researcher did some plant diversity work, and he looked, and was a study that went over many, many years, right? So, and I do really like these long-term studies because it gives you a sense of trends as opposed to a snapshot in time, which sometimes can be misleading. So they manipulated the amount of diversity by adding different seeds, and there was a lot of weeding that occurred. And like myself, a lot of their productivity measures were as biomass, both above and below ground, with grasses in particular, but with other species as well. But particularly with grasses, below ground biomass can tell you a lot about its function, and a lot of the biomass of the plant is actually underground. So you'll see that in those underground environments. I'll close this door. So in these studies, they found that there is a significant effect of diversity, and this was particularly more the case the later the study went, right? So again, a good reason to do things over a long period of time where you have that opportunity. Um, but overall, what they found was the higher diversity plots were more productive than even the best monocultures. And so when they did a comparison, and I put a link down here, and you can read one of these papers, is I think really interesting. And this graph comes directly from that paper. But you can see that when we're talking about biomass production, where you had the most species, you had the most biomass. And that took into account all of these other metrics that they also looked at. So they didn't only look at the number of different species, but they looked at the amount of nitrogen that was available, the amount of water, whether there was enough carbon dioxide, the levels of the carbon dioxide, herbivory, fire, all of these different things. And they found that species diversity had the most effect, right? It had the most effect over anything else in terms of biomass production. And that the more species you had, the more biomass you tended to see. Um, and that, again, that really speaks to these kind of synergistic, to use a term from toxicology, but to these kind of synergistic relationships that can occur in these very diverse communities between these different species. So, what caused this result? In some instances, this could have been mycorrhizal associations that help with nitrogen fixation with these plants. So here you've got this kind of facilitation between these two different species that were benefiting both, but you really see it in this study when in measuring the biomass of the plants. In some cases, there would be synergistic interactions where plants that are able to chemically defend themselves against herbivores also kind of extend that benefit by their neighbors that might be more palatable. So here again, you have facilitation. And then also you can have resource partitioning that occurs where um, different species are not competing necessarily for the same resource directly with each other. All right, so that might be for nutrients, water, space, whatever, but they're not directly competing with each other. So that could be an example I use here is root depth. So some prairie grasses, for instance, have very deep roots where other species might have more shallow roots. And that allows them to access different layers of the soil so they're not competing with one another. And that benefits everybody, right? Okay, so this all relates to ecological succession, right? Which again, you would have studied in your biology classes. And so this is about creating beneficial or hostile conditions, right? So you have inhibition between different plants, you have facilitation, sometimes you have tolerance. We've talked about that already in those other five inner relationships. And you really see this come into play where you have disturbances, whether that is a primary or secondary disturbance. There's this hypothesis, the intermediate hypothesis, that these small disturbances can actually create more diverse environments. So think about a hurricane or a tropical storm when it comes through our area, that can create some disturbance that might kind of shake that community up, and that can provide for a more dynamic environment that allows some species to gain a little bit of a foothold and increase the overall biodiversity in that community over time, reaching a climax community, filling all of the ecologic niches that can be filled in that particular community. Um, so, we've talked about Disticula spicata, for instance, and I know you've seen some in your laboratories, and this is a species that we typically consider a pioneer species. So when dunes form, for instance, it's one of the first things that gets out over the dune and starts to stabilize that dune. But in a lot of different environments, it plays this key role in helping facilitate conditions that allow other plants to come in. So it doesn't all happen to be very extreme conditions where you have barren soil. It can happen in environments that maybe suffer from some sort of intermediate disturbance, and this can allow for resilience over time. And then the more biodiversity you have, the more resistant that community can be over time as well. So there have been some studies. The Sullivan one is one, and it was a greenhouse study, and it looked again at above and below ground biomass, as some of my work has done. And what they found was that the benefits of diversity really depended on the metric and the species identified. So more diverse mixtures tended to have higher above ground biomass. Um, there was some linkage in the plots where they had Salicornia, that so this is the succulent plant. You've seen this in your field work and studied it already, but so this is a very strong competitor against other species. So because it's so competitive, even in these salt and anoxic environments that have so few species, where you have Salicornia, it can displace other things. So the overall gains in biomass they saw, because it is a relatively small plant, were relatively modest compared to what the expectation might have been. However, there were some benefits there as well. So more diverse mixtures had lower shoot nitrogen shocks, so meaning there were less significant fluctuations in the amount of nitrogen that was present in the soil. And this is linked directly in this study to the presence of this grass. The common name is arrowgrass. I will spare you my pronunciation of the genus there. But so this is a small plant, has annual shoots, but it has perennial roots like a lot of marsh grasses do, right? And so they again found that the nitrogen tended to be more steady in the presence of this plant. So I guess the upshot of this is that diversity, the actual benefits are fairly complex. There's a lot of things going on between these different plants that can facilitate, inhibit, or in some cases provide no difference. Um, But generally, you're more likely to have highly productive species and facilitative interactions in these more diverse communities because you have more different species with different genetic characteristics that allow them to um, facilitate one another, but also to survive under a wider range of conditions, sometimes with duplicate ecologic niches where there can be ecologic overlaps occurring. And so the overall takeaway from that is the more diverse the community is, generally the more successful it's going to be. Um, and that leads me to stability. So I talked a little bit about this, right? All systems are in a constant state of change. And there's a wide array of things that could be considered intermediate disturbances. But even just normal day-to-day things that happen in any given environment require the living organisms in those environments to adjust, right? And this occurs through a whole variety of different positive and negative feedback mechanisms. But this is important because this allows the species and thus the communities that they occupy to be more resistant to changes that occur, to shocks that occur. So you saw that with the nitrogen a little while ago, but also more resilient. So when you have a stronger disturbance come through, they're more likely to recover more quickly because of the diversity that's present and the variety of niches that are available. I liken this to hurricanes. So when Hurricane Ike, for instance, when it hit Galveston Bay, um, west of Galveston Bay recovered much more quickly. Part of that had to do with the effects of the storm were slightly lesser than they were on the eastern part of Galveston Bay, so think Anahuac. But part of it also had to do with the fact that there are so many services available in this area because there's so many people and so many resources available. Whereas you go out into these smaller communities out in Chambers County, there are fewer people to do any given job and fewer services available overall. And so that recovery process took much longer over there. And it's not distinctly different in these biologic communities. The more different species you have, the more ecologic niches you have filled, typically the more resistant and resilient they are to change. Um, so you'll hear this term sometimes referred to as complexity. And so the greater the species richness is at each trophic level, generally, the more stable that community, the more resistant, resilient it's going to be. Um, Also, it's important to know that there are minimum thresholds below which communities can fail. And this does include these coastal plant communities. But again, it varies by community, it varies by biome. So what happens in a saltwater environment may not be exactly the same as what would happen in a brackish or a freshwater environment because of the number of species that are involved. Um, there is also what's referred to as the species equilibrium model. So one of the parameters that you have to take into consideration not only is the diversity, but also the space that's available because bigger spaces oftentimes can allow more individuals within each species, but also more species. So you have more species richness, more biodiversity. So you see this comparison in this model. They refer to islands, large and small islands, and large islands tend to be more diverse and more persistent over time than smaller islands do. Um, so examples of this and that are when we look at biodiversity loss and the impacts that can have are occurring right here in the Houston Galveston area. And one of the worst areas isn't actually in the coastal margin, it's actually up in these freshwater environments north of Houston. So you can think Katy, Sugarland, those areas that are developing. Montgomery County actually is another area that's starting to grow pretty rapidly. So a colleague of mine with Texas A&M, the Texas Coastal Watershed Program, John Jacob, did a study. This is a few years old now, but they looked at wetland losses using aerial imagery between 1990 and 2002, so over a 12-year period. And they found that the losses in these wetlands were primarily concentrated in these areas identified, and it was primarily to forested and riparian forest wetlands. So we looked a little bit at those a little earlier in the semester, and these wetlands are particularly important, and the species that are in them are particularly important because they impact water quality, flood retention. They have habitat values that are not replicated anywhere else in the system. And so when I talked about minimum thresholds, I want you to see what that looks like in our particular area. So this is an aerial image that has an overlay of the National Wetlands Inventory Maps, or NWI maps, overlaid on it. So inside of these yellow lines, and let me get my laser pointer back here. All right, so, oh, no, I want the pen, the pointer. Here we go. All right, so inside of these yellow lines are areas that via the NWI would be identified as wetland environments, meeting all of those wetlands criteria. And also, this is a color infrared image. So that means that these areas that are redder are emitting more heat and are then interpreted to be drier because those dry surfaces reflect more of that heat off of the surface, whereas the wetter surfaces hold on to that heat energy. We talked about that when we talked about climate change. Okay, so this is prior to a development. This is a couple of years later. All right, so let me go back. This is before, after. And the consequence of this is what this subdivides this community. And so, where at one time you had one large island where there was a lot of interaction among the different biologic populations in this whole parcel, now you have a parcel that is severely divided into smaller islands. Okay. And the consequence of this can be, now I don't know if this was specifically the case in this area, but what we typically see is that if the number of species gets to be too small, that there aren't enough ecologic niches filled, the biologic community fails. Okay, so there are thresholds below which you can't go within these biologic communities. They're stronger with more biologic diversity, and they can become weaker to the point of failure the less biologic diversity there is. All right. Well, I think that wraps up what I wanted to talk to you about today. So, from this, you should be able to talk about what types of ecologic interactions are occurring in these coastal communities. What biodiversity is, how we measure it, what are the benefits of biodiversity, and what kind of things determine ecologic stability in these coastal habitats. So with that, I thank you as always for your patience and your spending your time with me in these videos and in class, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.